Hello, everybody, and welcome to ISCN 2021. My name is Luca Fontana, and I'm the Sustainable Mobility Manager here at EPFL. During this session, you will have 4 presentations of Swiss universities. We had the same objective to reduce the impact of air travel, but implemented different strategies. During this session, we really want to share good and bad experiences in this project of reducing air travel. You will have 4 presentations. I will start with our experience at EPFL. Then there will be Susan Gerlinger, who is co-leader of the mobility platform at ETH Zurich, followed by Jean-Marie Greter, who is vice rector at the University of Neuchâtel, and finally Arne Menn, who is head of the sustainability office at the University of Basel. What was the initial situation at EPFL? So we really started with a travel policy without sustainability or duty of care measures. The academic freedom and finances always came first at the PFL, and there were only recommendations instead of incentive or restrictions. And I would say also that there was really little information about the impact of flights among the researchers, but also the administrative staff. So our first step was to collect data and analyze them. We realized that business mobility accounts for 24% of the total CO2 emission of EPFL. And among those 24%, 96% are generated by planes. So it's really planes that we need to tackle if we want to reduce the footprint of the university. With data collection, we also were able to better understand the practices. We have very in-depth data about the CO2 emission of staff and students and about the statuses. We really now understand the reasons for flying and which are the practices, for example, which distances are traveled by plane, or the travel classes that are used at the PFL, but also information about the destinations. Here is an example about student flights. We really now have a better understanding on the destination and how much those destinations account to the CO2 emissions. Why the data is important? I think it's really important to collect good data, to have an overall vision of practices and needs, to identify the biggest potential for improvement, for example, about the destinations. We can monitor evolutions and capitalize on good practices. We did a lot of communication about the train usage or the video conferences. And I think it's really important also to do a communication about alternatives. We really wanted to inform and raise awareness also in the community, which had very little information about flights. And can data alone change policies? I would say no. First, you need a cultural change. We try to present those data at the direction, and they said us that instead they wanted a pilot project. So we started a pilot project at the Faculty of Life Sciences, and the project is called Travel Less Without Loss. And the goals of the pilot project was to create trust and reassure the direction and scientists about this project of reducing flights. We wanted to build consensus through participation and dialogue, to define measures specific to the faculty, for example, about video conferences. And I think it's important to have a pilot project to understand what works and what didn't work, and what is acceptable by the scientific community. So we started with a very soft approach. We edited guidelines for sustainable professional travel. We organized the exhibition information sessions about flights. We did some trainings also on sustainable travel planning. And we also did a study in 2 laboratories, and we realized that business travel accounts for more than 50% of the CO2 emissions of those laboratories. And this kind of studies really is a wake-up call for the professors leading the laboratories that now realize how much flights accounts on the footprint of the laboratory. We also worked a lot about video conferences. We installed 9 new video conferences rooms in the faculty, which are mutualized and free for all the members of the faculty. We did information and training about the usage of the tools of video conferences, and we increased IT support. So what worked and what didn't work about the pilot project? I would say that, first of all, there was a good visibility of the initiative and a very good acceptance. And we managed to raise awareness among the researchers. In 2019, we did a survey, and 80% of the researchers of the faculties affirmed the importance of reducing the impact of air travel. There was also an emulation effect by other faculties or services who wanted also to contribute in this project. So what didn't work? I think with a pilot project, you don't have a coherent policy for the entire universities. You create a sort of inequality between the university members. And I really think recommendations are not sufficient, especially for frequent travelers. So how did we move from a pilot project to a university project? We first of all capitalized on our experience about the pilot project. We did a communication about our achievements. And it was important for us also to find our champions, people, researchers, students, PhDs, who are really motivated to reduce the number of flights. You can also take advantage of existing public policies. It can be international agreements or national policies. In Switzerland, Switzerland aim at reducing by 50% CO2 emission by 2030. And this was a strong argument to reduce flights at the PFL. Or you can also capitalize on other universities and try to convince your board management that other universities are already working on flights. How did we try to implement a global policy on flights? So we got back again to data, and we realized that since the beginning of the pilot project, we had an increase by 8% of the number of flights at the PFL. And since the beginning of the pilot project, we had a decrease by 4% every year. And we also noticed that alternatives were increasing. Here is an example about international train travel. We noticed a strong increase between 2016 and 2019. So which are the next steps at the PFL? I would say that the most important news at the PFL is that there is a new vice president for responsible transformation with Professor Gisou van der Goot. And since the creation of the new vice presidency, we managed to get the coordination of the travel policy. So the travel policy is not coordinated by finance anymore, but by the sustainability office. And the unit, our unit, ensures a transversal coordination between the departments. So we afterwards proposed a global revision of the travel policy at the Direction, which was approved, and we are currently doing the revision, which aims at defining the measures for sustainability and duty of care, which aims to reduce CO2 emission from air travel by 50% by 2030, to promote alternatives to air travel. We really want to capitalize on the COVID situation to implement incentives and restriction for traveling, and adopt a participatory process with all the relevant departments and the entire EPFL community. So I really wanted to share the initial points and where we are now. And we did huge progresses since 2017. And we really started with data, with a project pilot, by speaking with a lot of people. And I think our experience shows that you need to take gradual steps if you want to implement a global policy for reducing air travel. So I thank you very much for your attention, and I will see you at the question and answer session just after the presentations. Thank you very much.
My name is Susanne Görlinger. I work at ETH Zurich since 2010, and I'm the project lead of ETH Zurich's flight reduction project, which I'm very happy to present here. The presentation has 3 parts. One about international flight reduction and why the topic is important for universities. One part, what we have done at ETH to reduce the flights. And finally, the lessons learned about our project. This slide shows a graphic recording from our ETH-wide event in January 2020. And it shows the different stages, the chances, the opportunities, and the problems about our project. If you want to know more about that, you can find it on our website. What is the development of worldwide air travel since 1950? This slide shows that and illustrates why we should really reduce the flights. You can see that passenger numbers have increased exponentially, and with Corona, we all know what that means. And this is not in line with the climate goal of Paris. You can also see certain dents like the oil shock, the Gulf War, 9/11, the global financial crisis. The graph doesn't extend till 2020, so you don't see the effect of Corona. But the question is if Corona will be a long-term effect or if we will see a rebound. Now, why is the reduction of flights relevant for universities at all? And I want to list 5 reasons. The first one is a study by Burrion from 2018 that scientists fly a lot more than the average person. The second one is that few academic and non-academic flyers are responsible for most emissions. And there are 4 studies I want to mention. The first one is from Wines and Donner from 2018. They look at the air travel emissions of around 1,500 individuals across 80 departments at the University of British Columbia. And they saw that 1/3 of these individuals do not fly at all, that 80% of the emissions are caused by 25% of flyers, and that 50% of the emissions are caused by 8% of flyers. There are 3 further studies which shows the inequality of flight emissions, and one of them is by Gößling and Humpe from 2020, and they saw that 1% of world population emits 50% of CO2 emissions from commercial aviation. The second by Oswald show that the top 10 consume 55% of mobility-related energy. And the third study by Hopkins and Cairns show that 75 to 76% of flights are taken by only 20% of people. The third reason why I think this topic is relevant for us is leading by example or trend setting. This is a study by Westlake from 2017, and they show that there is an appetite for leadership, and that leading by example, by giving up flying, appears to send a powerful and effective message. The third reason is credibility, and that's a study by Attari et al. and they show that the public finds scientists who fly less more credible. And the fifth study I find very interesting again is a study by Wines. And they look at the question, do you need to fly a lot to be successful? And they didn't find any significant influence on air travel on professional success. Now, what did we do at ETH Zurich to tackle that problem? We are monitoring our greenhouse gas emissions for business travel since 2006, and we know that more than half of our greenhouse gas emissions are from flights. We also know that over 90% of flights from staff, invited guests, and students are overseas flights, so long-distance flights. There were several measures since 2016, like sensitization measures, workshops. There was a top-down target, but none of those really resulted in a reduction. So when I designed the project, we did a mixture of top-down, and that was a governing board decision in 2017, and a bottom-up approach. And the implementation is by the departments, and they were asked by the governing board to define a reduction goal, a quantitative reduction goal, with the respective measures. And this led to an ETH-wide reduction target of an average of 15%. And we do not take into account compensation or the yearly efficiency gains of airlines, which is around 1 to 2%. Otherwise, our reduction target would be around 25% if we would account for the efficiency gains, like all the others do. And the reason why we do not account for it is we only want to take into account those measures we are responsible for, nothing externally. The project runs from 2019 till 2025, and we are monitoring our emissions. Now, what are the emissions? You can see here the emissions from 2006 till 2020 in total, in tons CO2 equivalent for flight of staff and guests in dark blue, and flight of students in light blue. And the student flights account for around 10%. You can also see that the emissions have steadily increased until 2015 and dropped between 2016 and 2018, which is also our reference period. So in 2019, fortunately, we already saw a reduction of 10% compared to this reference period, so-called in pink. And in 2020, in comparison to the reference period, there was a reduction of around 77%, which is of course due to Corona. How does it look like per FTE? Again, the emissions from 2006 till 2020, again for staff, guests, and students. And you can see that the emissions until 2015 are around 2 tons per FTE, steady. And that's because of the growth of ETH and that it increased per total, but not per FTE. And in 2016 to 2018, it was around 1.8 ton per FTE, and it decreased to 1.5 ton per FTE in 2019. How does it look like per group? This is the total again for admin and technical staff, bachelor and master students, PhD guests, professors and senior researchers for the years 2016 to 2019. And you can see that all groups contribute, but not equally. But all of that looks different per FTE, which you can see here again for the different groups and for the different years. And you can see that one prof emits around as many flight emissions as 2 guests, or around 5 senior researchers, or around 8 PhDs, or around 25 admin or tech, or around 84 students. And you can also see that the reduction is not equally distributed. And the reduction is the reduction in 2019 in comparison to the reference period 16 to 18. You see that the admin and technical staff have increased, and I think that's an error because we didn't so much take into account them in the monitoring period 16 to 18. The bachelor and master students, they have decreased by 26%, the PhDs by 10%. Most emission reduction occurred with guests, 53%. And the professors, as you see here, have not so much decreased, only by 13%, but they have the by far most emissions per FTE. And the senior researchers have decreased by around 25%. I want to mention briefly two studies I find quite interesting by Agnes Grall. She's a PhD student, and she looks at the flight reduction project. One study was a survey amongst professors in March 2020. And she found that 92% of the professors know the project, which is quite remarkable. 78% declare that they are ready to reduce their own flights, and 36 say that they already have reduced their flights in response to the project, which I think is quite a success. How does that look like for scientific staff? And that's a survey from November 2020, so in the midst of Corona. And the project is less known amongst professors, as you can see on the right-hand side. You see in blue the answer of the professors, how much they know it, and in red, the scientific staff. And on the right-hand side, you see those departments that where around 100% of the professors know the project, but you see a large difference in the scientific staff. Between 25 and 75% of them do know the project. And on the left-hand side, you see a department where only 50% of the professors know the project and only 33% of the scientific staff. So there is quite a difference between the departments, how they communicate the project and how well this is known. The second interesting finding in this survey is that amongst the scientific staff, the most commonly suggested reduction target is 50%, and that's quite different to those reduction targets of the departments. And a survey amongst the students will follow in June. Now, this is my last slide where I want to talk about the lessons learned. First, I think that top-down support is absolutely essential. But also, I think that the bottom-up involvement is also incredibly important. And for me, it's a mixture of both, because the travel decisions are made bottom-up by individuals. So we need to involve all staff and the students, and not just those that are interested. Transparency is a very powerful tool. If in some departments, they show the flight emissions per group with a name, and that really sparks a discussion. I don't think it's a finger pointing, it's really having the data, having the information, and then being able to discuss. For that, you need a good database for monitoring. And what I also saw over the years is the importance of the role of champions and influencers, and they can be trendsetters in their departments, and the departments themselves can be trendsetters. And last but not least, I think that the networks are really important, because only with a common approach of many organizations, we can be successful. Now, my conclusion is that we do need a cultural change. So we have to rethink our scientific system, and we have to rethink the current practices and the framework conditions internally and externally, such as the scientific exchange and conference organization. We have to rethink teaching and evaluation criteria and the funding schemes. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention.
Dans le cadre de la commission développement durable de l'université, c'était une idée qui nous trottait dans la tête depuis un moment. Comment est-ce qu'on pourrait faire pour réduire les émissions de gaz à effet de serre des déplacements en avion de la communauté universitaire? Et en 2018, on a décidé de former un petit groupe de travail pour étudier les possibilités qui s'adapteraient bien à notre université. On a proposé plusieurs solutions au rectorat qui allaient d'une solution très soft, volontaire, à une solution plus cadrée. Et c'est dans cette direction-là que finalement le rectorat est allé en choisissant d'imposer une taxe sur tous les déplacements en avion de l'ensemble de la communauté. Ensuite, nous avons discuté avec nos collègues dans les facultés, à l'association des professeurs par exemple, et nous avons été les premiers surpris de voir l'excellent accueil que les collègues ont réservé à cette proposition. En fait, s'il y a eu des commentaires de changement, d'amélioration, c'était plutôt allant dans le sens de renforcer cette proposition qui était faite à ce moment-là et qui a démarré en 2019.
Le nouveau régime est entré en vigueur en janvier 2019, moins d'1 an après le début des négociations. Les voyageuses et les voyageurs ne sont pas tenus de payer de leur poche, mais le montant correspondant de la taxe est déduit du budget de l'Institut et donc les incite à y réfléchir à 2 fois. L'année 2019 a été relativement encourageante. On a enregistré une diminution des vols au total d'environ 15% sur l'ensemble de l'université. Bien sûr, il est difficile d'attribuer à 100% ce résultat positif à la contribution climatique, vu la hausse de la prise de conscience généralisée durant cette année. Et puis, l'année 2020, ma foi, elle ne nous sert pas à grand-chose sur le plan de l'analyse de l'efficacité de cette mesure, compte tenu des réactions beaucoup plus radicales liées à la pandémie. Cela dit, le régime en place est bien accepté par la communauté universitaire et il permet de récolter durant une année normale une quarantaine de milliers de francs qui sont utilisés à des fins de promotion de la mobilité douce sur le campus, également en appui aux diverses associations d'étudiantes et d'étudiants qui sont actifs en matière de durabilité. Actuellement, pour un vol d'environ 1000 km, la taxe se monte à un peu plus de 10 francs. C'est bien, on pourrait faire mieux et on y réfléchit.
Parmi les résultats qui m'ont frappé de cette opération, c'est par exemple le fait que nos collègues qui organisent un voyage pour les étudiantes et les étudiants réfléchissent en amont désormais à la destination de ce voyage, alors qu'avant, ils choisissaient la destination, puis ils disaient on ne peut pas y aller autrement qu'en avion. Aujourd'hui, on choisit, en faisant la réflexion, est-ce qu'on peut choisir une destination équivalente où on pourrait aller en train?
Hello, this is Jean-Marie Greter speaking. I am Vice Rector at the University of Neuchâtel, and I would like to share our experience in terms of the introduction of a tax on air travel. A few words regarding our university settings, then I will describe the taxing scheme, the major outcomes, and I will finish with a few discussion caveats. For those of you who would like to discover Neuchâtel, please come in. Nice place on the northern west part of Switzerland. 4 faculties, a small university, a bit more than 4,000 students, 150 profs, but those people travel sometimes by plane to study, to get in touch with international colleagues. And airports, main airports of Switzerland are nearby: Basel, Zurich, Geneva. So we were thinking about the impact in terms of CO2 emissions of our travel activity. Roughly speaking, air travel represents 12% of total greenhouse gas emissions by the University of Neuchâtel and 75% of professional travel emissions. This corresponds to 2,000 flights per year, around 2 flights per full-time equivalent. And more than 60% of those flights are short haul. That means less than 1,500 kilometers, sorry. What could we do with that? We discussed during the year 2018 a lot about which type of incentive scheme we would like to introduce, compulsory or voluntary, introducing travel bans, or rather tax incentives. In the end, we decided rather to go for a tax. The tax scheme, introduced since January 2019, has the following principles. First, all flights managed by the accounting department are hit by the tax. The calculation of the tax is simple. We use the open source MyClimate calculator to estimate CO2 emissions. And then we apply the price of carbon on the EU market with a floor at 25 Swiss francs per ton. Then the tax is deducted from the Institute's ordinary budget. All flights are concerned, whoever travels by plane. There are two exceptions: travels funded by external agencies within the framework of SNF or EU projects, and travels funded by other universities. In a few diagrams, I would like to present the major outcomes now. First, regarding the price on the left-hand side, we were right to introduce a floor at 25 Swiss francs per ton as the price dropped below that minimum level beginning of year 2020. But even with that, the tax per flight on the right-hand side, you see its dispersion with box plots in the two most recent years, the tax is pretty small, below 10%, around 6% at the median. Of course, for larger flights, the tax is a higher share of the price of the flight. Then, what is the impact on the number of flights and on total emissions? First of all, I'm going to show you some pictures that include 2020. And of course, there is nothing better than a pandemic to reduce flights, but this is not what we should focus on. So as you see, the drop in the number of flights on the bottom left is quite important between 2019 and 2020, but we focus on that drop between 2018 and 2019, minus 15%, not bad. Of course, we cannot be 100% sure that this is due to the tax, but that was part of the incentives our members were facing. On the bottom right, you can see that the introduction of the tax was followed by an increase in the emission intensity per flight. That means larger flights or longer ones. That means the net impact of the two changes, number of flights and emission intensity, is ambiguous, but in the end, it decreases total emissions slightly by minus 4%. Last but not least, we reported what we did with the receipts taken from the tax. On the left-hand side here, they correspond more or less to 25,000 francs in 2019. Now, this was insufficient to cover all sustainability expenses on the campus, so the rectorate had to put an additional amount, more or less equivalent, and here are the different type of activities that were financed using the travel tax and the help from the rectorate. If you want more detailed information can be found in the full report. Here it is. To conclude, the experience we had at the University of Neuchâtel was rather positive, with a large acceptance due to the simplicity of the tax schedule. accountability and transparency of all the figures, and a local use of the tax receipts. Now, we should do better, and what we have in mind is to be more universal. That means also include flights from external funding sources, better coordinate with what happens in other universities in Switzerland and around the world, and probably be more stringent in terms of taxation. Larger cuts are needed in terms of CO2 emissions. Shortly speaking, that's all. Thanks a lot for your attention, and I will be happy to answer your questions in an interactive session.
Hello and welcome. My name is Arne Menn. I'm head of the Sustainability Office at the University of Basel. Our office initiates, supports, and coordinates sustainability initiatives at the University of Basel in research, teaching, and operations. Today, I will give a short presentation about our project Less for More that aims at reducing our air travel emissions. But first, a few words about my alma mater. Founded in the year 1460, the University of Basel is Switzerland's oldest university. Today, it is a research university with an extensive curriculum and has around 13,000 students and around 2,800 PhD students. The Basel region belongs to the most successful life science clusters in the world, and thus the university belongs to the world's best research institutions in this field as well. Sustainability is anchored in the university strategy, and sustainable principles are applied to research, teaching, and operations. Thus, reducing our carbon footprint is one of our main challenges today. On this slide, you can see the university's carbon footprint from 2017 to 2020 in tons of CO2. Air travel is responsible for an average of approximately 48%. This is the gray area. Heating, catering, electricity, and cooling account for the remaining emissions. So if air travel is responsible for just under 50% of the University of Basel's total greenhouse gas emissions, it is therefore a significant target area for the reduction of our CO2 emissions. That's why the President's Board has resolved to reduce flight-related greenhouse gas emissions by 30% relative to the 2017 and 2019 baseline. Because of the coronavirus pandemic, flight emissions declined by 80% in 2020. The challenge will be to keep the reduction under 30% after the pandemic is over. To achieve this, the faculties, departments, and institutes were called on to develop specific reduction measures, taking into account the disciplinary differences in research and teaching. So no top-down measures, but individual measures developed by each department. Annual monitoring of flight-related emissions will allow the effectiveness of the measures to be reviewed. And if necessary, we can adjust our process. How are we calculating our air travel emissions? Data collection is done with expense forms or reimbursement forms. The required flight data is manually retrieved from the existing files, usually scanned flight tickets. That is done in our accounting department. The system boundaries, all flights of employees, students, and guests are taken into account, provided that the costs are covered by the University of Basel. After that, we can calculate the university's carbon footprint and the emissions for each department. So each department gets a yearly monitoring of their flight emissions. Just a quick look at our air travel data. This graph shows our number of flights per distance group, short haul, middle haul, and long haul. But the more important slide is the next one. Here you can see the flight emissions per distance group in tons of CO2. Long haul flights account for only a third of air travel, so flights, but they are responsible for more than 80% of our CO2 emissions. The reasons are the greater distances, the higher altitudes, and greater fuel load. So in order to reduce our CO2 emissions, we will have to tackle the problem of intercontinental flights. In addition to our monitoring and the development of measures, we conducted a survey on the travel behavior of researchers and staff at the University of Basel in March 2021 in collaboration with the Center for Cognitive and Decision Sciences by Professor Rui Mata. The goal of the survey was to gain a better understanding of the travel behavior of our researchers and inform future interventions that do not compromise excellence in research and teaching. A total of 910 respondents participated in the survey with 138 professors, 674 other scientific staff, and around 100 administrative staff members. And the key findings were the 30% reduction target and the project's approach are strongly supported, almost 80% agreed. Then the potential negative impact of flight reductions on research and teaching. Productivity and quality of research hardly suffers, according to the respondents. International collaboration and personal reputation are most likely to be perceived as negatively effective, and professors perceive the possible effects more negatively than PhDs and postdocs. The acceptance of the various proposed measures is generally high, with 2 standing out: train instead of flight, 70%, and improving video conferencing infrastructure, with 68% receive the most support. Overall, that was interesting. Professors seem to be significantly less supportive of the proposed measures than postdocs and PhDs. Since October 2020, the Sustainability Office has guided and supported the university's organizational units in developing reduction measures that will be implemented this summer. And here are some of the measures that have been developed. Overall, units focused on recommendations for travel arrangement and flight rules. For example, only 2 persons are allowed to take the flight to a conference. Awareness raising measures and the so-called train instead of flight rules. That means, for example, a trip from Basel to Berlin can be done by train in around 7 hours. So if the department has an 8-hour rule, you are not allowed to take the plane to Berlin from Basel. Based on the feedback from the university units and the survey results, the following steps will be implemented, especially to reduce long-haul flights that are responsible for 80% of our emissions. We will introduce a carbon tax on CO2 in 2022. That will be a tax on flight emissions that will be introduced for the rectorate units and the central administration at first, with a price of 96 Swiss francs per ton of CO2. And the faculty and departments can voluntarily participate, and we will ask them to do so this summer. The resulting money from this climate fund will be made available to the Travel Fund for Young Academics in order to finance more sustainable mobility options, and so to reduce our CO2 emissions. The second step will be improvements for virtual and hybrid conferences. The survey results and feedback from our units clearly supported that infrastructure and support improvements in this area are necessary, so we will work on that as well. Yeah, for further information, please have a look at our project website. There you can also find supporting tools and awareness raising materials. In our new sustainability report, you can find all the data I just presented. And if you have questions after the ICN conference, please don't hesitate to contact me. Yes, thank you very much for your attention. That was a quick overview of our project to reduce air travel emissions at the University of Basel. And I'm looking forward to meet you, at least virtually, and to answer your questions in our session. Goodbye.